3 hours after my daughter-in-law Rebecca looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're just a guest here, Margaret. Don't forget that." I was sitting in my car outside a real estate office at 9 a.m., signing papers to sell the house she thought she'd inherit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But here's what Rebecca didn't know when she decided to humiliate me in front of my grandchildren last night. I wasn't just some helpless old widow she could push around and eventually discard. I was the woman who owned the beautiful colonial house she'd been treating as her personal kingdom. The same house she'd been planning to inherit, and had already started redecorating to her taste. Let me tell you how I went from being made to feel like an intruder in my own home to the woman who put a "for sale" sign on the front lawn while they were at work. It all started 2 years ago, when I made what I thought was the most generous decision of my life. After my husband Harold passed away from a heart attack, I was left rattling around in our large family home in Millbrook Heights, Connecticut. A beautiful 4-bedroom colonial that Harold and I had bought 40 years ago when we were young, and dreaming of filling it with children and grandchildren. The house had been our pride and joy. Harold had spent weekends refinishing the original hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places, installing custom built-in bookshelves in the study, and carefully restoring the original crown molding that gave each room its character. I'd lovingly tended to the garden that now bloomed with decades of carefully chosen perennials, the daffodils we'd planted the year Thomas was born, the rose bushes from our 20th anniversary, the maple tree we'd grown from a sapling that now towered over the backyard. Every room held layers of memories. The kitchen where I'd taught Thomas to make his great-grandmother's apple pie from scratch, where Harold and I had shared our morning coffee for 4 decades, where we'd celebrated every birthday and holiday. The living room with its stone fireplace, where we'd hosted countless Christmas mornings, where Thomas had taken his first steps, where Harold and I had slow danced to our wedding song on quiet Sunday evenings. The master bedroom where we'd whispered our dreams and fears, where I'd nursed Harold through his final illness, where he'd taken his last peaceful breath holding my hand. The house wasn't just where we lived. It was the foundation of everything we'd built together. Every improvement, every repair, every decorating decision had been made with love and intention. Harold had always joked that the house would outlast us both, and that someday our grandchildren would play in the same backyard where their father had learned to ride a bike. At 70, I was perfectly capable of maintaining the house myself. I was healthy, active, and had enough savings from Harold's life insurance policy and our carefully managed retirement accounts to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I still drove myself to the grocery store, managed my own finances, and kept up with the garden that was my pride and joy. The house might have been large, but it wasn't unmanageable. I'd hired a cleaning service to help with the deeper tasks, and my neighbor Bob kept an eye on things when I traveled to visit my sister in Florida. But the house felt enormous without Harold's presence filling it. I found myself talking to his photograph just to hear a human voice during the long winter evenings, and sometimes I'd set 2 places at the dinner table out of habit before catching myself and putting one away. The silence was the hardest part. After 43 years of marriage, I wasn't used to making decisions without Harold's input, wasn't used to watching television shows alone, wasn't used to going to bed without saying goodnight to someone who loved me. Thomas, my only child, had been calling me almost daily since his father's funeral 6 months earlier. At first, I thought it was sweet. Finally, some regular contact with my son, who'd grown increasingly distant since marrying Rebecca 5 years ago. But it quickly became clear that these weren't check-ins motivated by concern for my emotional well-being. Instead, every conversation seemed designed to highlight my supposed vulnerability and isolation. "Mom, it's just not safe for someone your age to be living alone in such a big house," he'd say during our phone calls, his voice taking on the patient tone people use with children. "What if you fall down those stairs? What if you have a medical emergency and no one finds you for days? What if someone breaks in and you can't defend yourself?" His concerns might have seemed reasonable to an outsider, but I knew better. Thomas had never worried about my safety when Harold was alive, even though we'd been the same ages living in the same house. He'd never expressed concern about the stairs I'd been climbing for 40 years, or the security system Harold and I had installed after a rash of break-ins in the neighborhood 5 years earlier. Rebecca and I have been talking, he'd continue, and we think you should seriously consider moving to one of those nice senior living communities. There's a beautiful one about 20 minutes from our house, Sunset Manor. They have activities, medical staff on site, and you'd have friends your own age to spend time with. Senior living communities. The phrase made my skin crawl. I'd visited friends in places like that. Sterile environments where independents went to die, where meals were served at predetermined times, where activities were planned by well-meaning staff who treated residents like children. I wasn't ready to be warehoused with other widows, playing bingo 3 times a week, and waiting for visits from family members who saw us as obligations rather than people. I was still sharp, still capable, still very much in control of my own life. My doctor had pronounced me in excellent health at my last checkup. I managed my own investments, maintained my own social calendar, and had recently joined a book club that met at the local library. I volunteered at the animal shelter twice a week and had started taking watercolor painting classes at the community center. This wasn't the profile of someone who needed to be managed and supervised, but Thomas was persistent, and his wife Rebecca was even more so. Rebecca had always been a force of nature, tall, blonde, and commanding, with the kind of confidence that made people assume she knew what she was talking about even when she didn't. She worked in pharmaceutical sales and approached every conversation like a pitch meeting, armed with statistics and talking points designed to wear down resistance. "Margaret," she'd say during their visits, using my first name in a way that somehow managed to sound both familiar and condescending. "I've been researching senior living options, and the statistics are really eye-opening. Did you know that falls are the leading cause of injury-related death among people over 65? And that social isolation contributes to cognitive decline at twice the rate of normal aging?" She'd arrive with printed articles from medical websites, glossy brochures from retirement communities, and stories about friends whose elderly parents had thrived after making the transition to senior living. Every conversation was carefully orchestrated to make me feel like staying in my own home was not just foolish, but selfish, as if my desire for independence was somehow putting an unfair burden on my family. "We just worry about you, Mom," Thomas would add, playing the role of the concerned son while Rebecca delivered the hard sell. "We want to know you're safe and happy." But I could see through their concern to the real motivation underneath. Thomas had always been financially irresponsible, the kind of person who lived paycheck to paycheck despite earning a decent salary as a marketing manager. He'd borrowed money from Harold and me multiple times over the years, for a down payment on his first house, to cover Rebecca's student loans, to pay for their wedding that cost more than my first car. We'd never asked him to pay us back because that's what parents do for their children. But I knew that our house represented financial security for him in a way that his own career never had. The house was worth nearly $800,000 now, according to the most recent property assessment. In a market where young families were struggling to afford their first homes, Thomas and Rebecca saw our colonial as their ticket to a lifestyle they couldn't otherwise afford. They'd never said it directly, but I could see it in the way Rebecca's eyes lit up when she talked about the potential of certain rooms, in the way Thomas casually mentioned how much houses in our neighborhood were selling for, in the way they both seemed to assume that eventually, inevitably, the house would be theirs. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't ready to give up my independence, my memories, or my home just because it would make their lives easier. I'd worked alongside Harold for 4 decades to pay off the mortgage on this house. I'd scraped and saved and made sacrifices so we could afford the down payment when Thomas was just a toddler. This wasn't just a piece of real estate to me. It was the physical embodiment of everything Harold and I had built together. But their pressure campaign was relentless. They'd bring their twin boys, Jake and Mason, my 12-year-old grandsons, on their visits and make pointed comments about how much space the house had, how great it would be for the boys to have their own rooms instead of sharing the small bedroom in Thomas and Rebecca's townhouse. They'd walk through the rooms making observations about what could be updated or modernized, as if my home was just a renovation project waiting to happen. "This kitchen has such great bones," Rebecca would say, running her manicured fingers along the countertops Harold and I had saved for 2 years to afford. With some updates, maybe granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, an island, it could be absolutely stunning. "The living room gets amazing light," Thomas would add, looking around the space where I'd rocked him to sleep as a baby. "You could really open this up, maybe take down that wall to the dining room, create more of an open concept feel." They weren't just admiring my home, they were redesigning it in their minds, erasing the choices Harold and I had made and replacing them with their own vision. And they were doing it right in front of me, as if I wasn't there, as if my opinions about my own house didn't matter. The breaking point came 6 months after Harold's death, during what I thought was just a casual Sunday dinner invitation. Thomas had called that morning asking if they could come over with the boys, saying Rebecca was making her famous lasagna and they wanted to share it with me. I was touched by the gesture. It had been weeks since we'd had a real family meal together, and I missed the noise and chaos of having children in the house. But when they arrived that evening, I realized this wasn't a social visit. They'd brought a folder full of documents, real estate listings, and what Rebecca called a transition plan. Over dinner, while Jake and Mason played video games in the living room, Thomas and Rebecca presented their proposal like it was a business meeting. "Mom, we've given this a lot of thought," Thomas began, his tone serious and practiced. "We think the best solution for everyone would be for you to move into Sunset Manor. We've already put you on the waiting list, and for our family to move into the house." I nearly choked on my lasagna. "Move into my house?" "Well, technically, we'd buy it from you," Rebecca said smoothly, pulling out a folder of papers. "We've had it appraised, and we're prepared to offer you fair market value. Then you'd use that money for your care at Sunset Manor, and we'd take over the mortgage and maintenance responsibilities." "What mortgage?" I asked, confused. "Harold? And I paid off this house 15 years ago." "Right, so it would be even easier," Thomas said, misunderstanding my point entirely. "We'd handle all the paperwork, help you move, take care of everything. You wouldn't have to worry about any of it." I looked back and forth between them, trying to process what they were suggesting. They wanted me to sell them my home, the house, where I'd lived for 40 years, where every room held irreplaceable memories, so they could move in and I could go live in a nursing home. And they were presenting this as if they were doing me a favor. "I don't want to move to Sunset Manor," I said quietly. "Mom, I know change is scary," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she used with her children. "But you'll love it there. They have a beautiful dining room, organized activities, transportation to doctor's appointments. You won't have to worry about maintaining this big house anymore." "I'm not worried about maintaining my house. I like maintaining my house." "But Mom," Thomas said, leaning forward earnestly, "think about us too. The boys are getting older, they need more space. Rebecca and I have been talking about having another baby, and our townhouse is already too small. This house is perfect for a growing family." And there it was, the real reason for their sudden concern about my safety and well-being. They didn't want me to be happy or secure in my golden years. They wanted my house, and I was an inconvenience standing in their way. "Thomas," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "this is my home. I'm not selling it, and I'm not moving to a nursing home. I'm 70 years old, not 90. I'm perfectly capable of living independently." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Rebecca's smile became fixed and cold, and Thomas looked genuinely shocked. as if my refusal to hand over my life's greatest asset was somehow unreasonable. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly about this," Thomas said. "What happens when you can't climb those stairs anymore? What happens when you can't drive? What happens when you need medical care? When that happens, I'll deal with it then, just like every other adult in the world." "But why wait until there's a crisis?" Rebecca interjected. "Why not make the transition now, while you can still adjust to a new lifestyle?" "Margaret, I have to be honest with you. I think you're being selfish." The word hung in the air like a slap. Selfish. For wanting to live in my own home. For not wanting to sell my most precious possession to accommodate their convenience. For not being grateful that they were willing to help me by taking everything I had left of my life with. "Harold, I think you should both leave now," I said, standing up from the table. "Mom," Thomas started. "Leave. We can talk about this another time when everyone has had a chance to cool down." They gathered their papers and their children and left without another word, the atmosphere thick with resentment and disappointment. As I cleaned up the dishes from what should have been a pleasant family dinner, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law. They didn't see me as a person with her own desires and agency. They saw me as an obstacle to their plans, a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed, and that realization was more heartbreaking than any loneliness I'd felt since Harold's death. That was 2 years ago, and their campaign to get me out of my house had only intensified since then. The morning after that disastrous dinner, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt since Harold's funeral. As I made my coffee in the kitchen that Rebecca wanted to gut and modernize, I realized that my son and daughter-in-law had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. They saw a grieving widow who could be manipulated through guilt and fear. What they didn't see was a woman who had spent 43 years building a life alongside a man who'd taught me that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse, to enable other people's poor choices. Harold had been a high school principal for 35 years, and he'd had a saying that I'd heard him repeat to countless students, parents, and even our own son. Respect is earned through actions, not demanded through relationship. He'd applied that philosophy to every aspect of our lives, including family dynamics. When Thomas had come to us as a 25-year-old asking for money to cover his credit card debt for the 3rd time, Harold had sat him down for a conversation that changed the trajectory of our relationship with our son. "Son," Harold had said, his voice gentle but firm, "your mother and I love you unconditionally. But love doesn't mean we're obligated to rescue you from the consequences of your choices. If we keep bailing you out, we're not helping you. We're teaching you that responsibility is optional." Thomas had been angry at the time, accusing us of being cruel and unsupportive. But 6 months later, when he'd figured out how to manage his finances on his own, he'd called to thank Harold for forcing him to grow up. That was the Harold I'd fallen in love with. A man who understood that true kindness sometimes required difficult boundaries. I'd lost sight of that wisdom in the years so. Months after Harold's death, grief had made me vulnerable to Thomas and Rebecca's manipulation, desperate for connection with the only family I had left. But their dinner proposal had awakened something in me that I'd forgotten I possessed. Harold's unwillingness to be pushed around by people who mistook kindness for weakness. I spent that morning doing something I hadn't done since Harold's death. I made a list of everything I loved about my life exactly as it was. The list was longer than I'd expected. My morning routine of coffee on the back porch, watching the cardinals that nested in the oak tree Harold had planted for our 20th anniversary. My Tuesday book club at the library, where I'd formed genuine friendships with women who shared my love of historical fiction and gardening advice. My volunteer work at the animal shelter, where I helped socialize cats who'd been abandoned or surrendered by families who'd grown tired of caring for them. My watercolor painting classes, where I was slowly learning to capture the way light fell through the windows of my sunroom at different times of day, my independence, my ability to eat dinner at 5 p.m. or 8 p.m., depending on my mood, my freedom to rearrange furniture or redecorate rooms without consulting anyone else's preferences, my right to decide how to spend my money, my time, and my energy. Most importantly, my home itself. The creaky floorboard in the hallway that Harold had never gotten around to fixing, which now served as an early warning system when the cats tried to sneak upstairs. The built-in window seat in the master bedroom where I'd read thousands of books over the decades. The kitchen island where I'd helped Jake and Mason with homework during their shorter visits, before Rebecca had decided I was too confused to be trusted with supervising children. I wasn't lonely in the way Thomas and Rebecca wanted me to be. I was alone, yes, but there's a profound difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is painful, desperate, something that drives people to make poor decisions just to feel connected to others. Solitude, on the other hand, is peaceful. It's the freedom to be authentically yourself without having to manage other people's emotions or expectations. What I was experiencing wasn't the desperate isolation of an elderly woman who needed to be rescued. It was the hard-earned peace of someone who'd raised her children, buried her husband, and finally reached the stage of life where she could prioritize her own well-being without guilt. But Thomas and Rebecca had interpreted my contentment as depression, my independence as denial, my refusal to uproot my life for their convenience as evidence that I was no longer capable of making rational decisions. And over the 2 years following that dinner, they doubled down on their campaign to convince me, and anyone else who would listen, that I was a danger to myself. The tactics they employed were subtle at first, the kind of manipulation that's difficult to identify unless you know what to look for. During family gatherings, Rebecca would make concerned comments about my memory lapses. Things like forgetting that she didn't like mushrooms in her salad, or mixing up the names of her co-workers when she told long, boring stories about her pharmaceutical sales job. "Oh, Margaret forgot again," she'd say with a sympathetic smile, as if my failure to memorize her preferences was evidence of cognitive decline rather than simple lack of interest. She'd ask me the same questions multiple times during a single visit. "How's your arthritis, Margaret? Are you still taking those supplements I recommended?" And then act concerned when I pointed out that she'd already asked me that 20 minutes earlier. "I did? Oh my, you're right. I'm so sorry. I just worry about you so much that I can't keep track of what we've already discussed." But the implication was clear. If I was confused about whether we'd already covered a topic, maybe I was the one with memory problems. Thomas, meanwhile, focused on my supposed physical limitations. He'd insist on carrying grocery bags that weighed less than my purse, hover nervously when I climbed the stairs to get something from the second floor, and make pointed observations about how tired I looked after perfectly normal activities. "Mom, are you sure you should be gardening for so long?" he'd ask after finding me planting bulbs in the backyard. "You've been out here for almost an hour. Maybe you should come inside and rest." "Thomas, I'm 70, not 90. An hour of light gardening isn't going to kill me." I know. I just worry about you overexerting yourself. What if you got dizzy and fell? What if you had a heart episode like Dad?" The constant implications that I was one misstep away from disaster began to wear on me psychologically. I found myself second-guessing activities I'd been doing for decades, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I was being reckless by living independently. Maybe I was too old to be trusted with my own judgment. It was a particularly insidious form of gaslighting, designed to make me doubt my own perceptions and capabilities. Every time I felt confident and capable, one of them would make a comment that reminded me of my age, my widowhood, my supposed vulnerability. They were systematically undermining my self-confidence to make their eventual takeover seem like a mercy rather than a theft. The campaign escalated after I'd refused their dinner proposal for the third time. Rebecca began showing up unannounced, for wellness checks, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given Thomas for emergencies and acting shocked to find me living normally. "Margaret, you left your coffee cup in the sink from this morning," she'd say, as if this was evidence of dangerous neglect rather than normal human behavior. "Yes, Rebecca. I'll wash it with the rest of the dishes after lunch. But what if you forget? What if dirty dishes pile up and attract insects?" She'd walk through my house with the critical eye of a health inspector, pointing out minor maintenance issues that any homeowner deals with routinely. A light bulb that had burned out in the guest bedroom became evidence that I couldn't safely navigate my own home in the dark. A small water stain on the bathroom ceiling, the result of a roof leak that had been professionally repaired 6 months earlier, became proof that I wasn't capable of maintaining the property. "Margaret, this could be dangerous," she'd say, photographing the stain with her phone. "Water damage can lead to mold, and mold exposure can cause serious health problems for someone your age. Rebecca, that stain is from a leak that was fixed months ago. The roofer said there was no structural damage, and I've had it inspected twice since then. But how can you be sure? Maybe you should have it tested for mold. Or better yet, maybe this is a sign that it's time to consider a living situation where you don't have to worry about maintenance issues." She'd helpfully rearrange things in my kitchen, moving items to locations that made more sense to her but left me unable to find anything for days. When I complained, she'd act hurt and confused. "I was just trying to help, Margaret. I thought it would be easier for you to reach the coffee filters if they were in the cabinet next to the coffee maker instead of above the stove. I'm sorry if that upset you." But the implication was always that my upset was unreasonable, that I should be grateful for her interference, that my desire to keep my own belongings where I wanted them was evidence of inflexibility and confusion. Thomas, meanwhile, began involving my neighbors in their campaign. He'd call Mrs. Henderson next door to check on me if I didn't answer my phone immediately when he called. He'd ask Bob across the street to keep an eye on my driveway and let him know if my car was gone for more than a few hours, supposedly because he worried about me getting lost or having an accident. "Mom, Bob mentioned that your car was gone all day Tuesday," he'd say during our phone calls. "Where did you go? Were you feeling okay to drive?" I went to the library for book club, then stopped at the grocery store and the garden center. "It's called having a life, Thomas." I know. I just worry when you're driving around for hours by yourself. What if something had happened? How would we know where to find you?" The surveillance felt suffocating. I began to feel like I needed permission to leave my own house. Like every decision I made was being monitored and evaluated by people who'd already decided I was incompetent. My neighbors, who'd been friendly acquaintances for decades, started looking at me with the pitying expressions people reserve for elderly relatives who can no longer take care of themselves. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been borrowing cups of sugar and sharing gardening tips with me for 20 years, began speaking to me in the slow, loud voice people use with children and the mentally impaired. "How are you today, Margaret? Are you taking your medications? Do you need me to call Thomas for you?" The assumption that I needed to be managed, monitored, and eventually relocated became so pervasive that I started to wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe I was being stubborn and unrealistic. Maybe my insistence on staying in my own home was selfish and dangerous. That doubt lasted exactly until Rebecca made her biggest mistake. 6 months ago, she'd shown up at my house with a real estate agent in tow, claiming she'd arranged a consultation to help me understand my options for downsizing. The agent, a polished woman in her 40s named Linda, had walked through my home taking notes and photos, while Rebecca provided commentary about all the ways the house was too much for someone my age. "As you can see, there are stairs throughout the house," Rebecca had said, as if stairs were a recent and dangerous addition to residential architecture. "And the master bedroom is on the 2nd floor, which means Margaret has to climb stairs every night just to go to bed." "The kitchen appliances are quite old," Linda had noted, eyeing my perfectly functional refrigerator and stove. "Replacement costs could be significant, especially if there are any safety issues with the older electrical systems. Exactly, Rebecca had agreed. And the yard requires constant maintenance. Margaret tries to keep up with it, but at her age, all that bending and lifting could be dangerous. They'd spent an hour cataloging everything that was supposedly wrong with my beautiful home, treating me like I wasn't even there. When Linda had finally presented her assessment, that the house was worth approximately $750,000, but would likely need at least $50,000 in updates to appeal to modern buyers, Rebecca had nodded sagely as if this confirmed her concerns about my living situation. You see, Margaret, this is exactly what Thomas and I have been trying to tell you. The house is becoming a burden instead of an asset. Wouldn't it make more sense to sell now while the market is good and use that money to secure a comfortable retirement? I'd listened to their presentation with growing anger, but it was Linda's final comment that pushed me over the edge. Mrs. Patterson, I have to say, your daughter-in-law really has your best interests at heart. So many elderly people resist making practical changes until it's too late, until they're forced to sell under emergency circumstances and lose money in the process. You're lucky to have family members who are looking out for your future. That's when I realized what Rebecca had been doing. She hadn't brought Linda here to help me understand my options. She'd brought Linda here to provide professional validation for the narrative she'd been building, that I was an elderly woman, in denial about her limitations, that my house was too much for me to handle, that the loving family members trying to help me were my only protection against future disaster. I think you should both leave now, I'd said, my voice calm despite the fury building in my chest. Margaret, we're just trying to help, Rebecca had protested. No, you're not. You're trying to manipulate me into making a decision that benefits you, and I won't be manipulated. After they'd left, I'd called Linda's real estate office and spoken to her supervisor. I'd explained that the consultation had been arranged without my knowledge or consent, that I had no intention of selling my home, and that any future contact from their agency should be directed to my attorney. Then I'd done something I should have done months earlier. I'd called my lawyer, Michael Chen, who'd handled Harold's estate planning and our wills. I'd explained the situation and asked him to send a cease and desist letter to Rebecca, warning her that any future attempts to involve real estate agents or other professionals in pressure campaigns would be considered harassment. Margaret, Michael had said after I'd finished describing 2 years of increasingly aggressive manipulation, what you're describing sounds like a systematic attempt to establish grounds for a conservatorship or guardianship proceeding. What does that mean? It means they may be building a case to have you declared legally incompetent, so they can take control of your finances and living situation. The wellness checks, the involvement of neighbors and real estate agents, the documentation of supposed memory problems, these could all be used as evidence that you're no longer capable of making your own decisions. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just trying to convince me to sell my house. They were potentially building a legal case to take control of my life entirely. Michael, what can I do? First, we're going to document everything. I want you to write down every incident you can remember, every time they've made concerning comments about your memory or physical capabilities, every uninvited visit or check-in. Second, we're going to get you a comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation to establish your competency. Third, we're going to review your estate planning documents to make sure your wishes are clearly documented and legally protected. And fourth, we're going to make it very clear to your son and daughter-in-law that any attempts to pursue conservatorship or guardianship without legitimate medical grounds will be met with aggressive legal resistance. That conversation had taken place 3 months ago, and since then, I'd been meticulously documenting every interaction with Thomas and Rebecca. The patterns Michael had warned me about became even clearer once I knew what to look for. They weren't just concerned family members. They were potential predators systematically undermining my independence to justify taking control of my assets. But their biggest mistake was underestimating my intelligence and determination. They thought they were dealing with a vulnerable widow who could be gradually worn down through constant pressure and manipulation. What they'd actually done was awaken the same protective instincts that had helped Harold and me navigate 43 years of marriage, raise a child, build a successful life together, and weather every crisis that had come our way. Harold had always said that you could tell everything you needed to know about a person's character by watching how they treated people who couldn't fight back. For 2 years, Thomas and Rebecca had shown me exactly who they were. Now it was time for me to show them who I was. The woman they were about to meet wasn't the grieving, confused widow they'd been manipulating. She was Margaret Patterson, homeowner, taxpayer, voter, and fully competent adult who'd had quite enough of being treated like a child by people who should have been treating her with respect. And she was about to remind them that underestimating a 70-year-old woman with nothing left to lose is a very dangerous mistake. 3 months after my consultation with Michael Chen, I thought I had successfully established boundaries that would protect me from further manipulation. The cease and desist letter had been delivered. My medical evaluations had all confirmed my complete competency, and I'd begun to feel like I was finally in control of my own life again. Rebecca's surprise visits had stopped. Thomas's constant wellness checks had been reduced to weekly phone calls, and for the first time in 2 years, I was sleeping peacefully in my own home without wondering what new scheme they might be plotting. Should have known the calm wouldn't last. The incident that would change everything began on a crisp October morning when I decided to take advantage of the beautiful fall weather to tackle some seasonal yard work. Connecticut autumns are spectacular, and my property looked like something from a postcard with the maple trees blazing red and gold against the gray stone of the colonial house. Harold and I had always loved this time of year. It was when we'd done our best work in the garden, preparing the flower beds for winter and planting the spring bulbs that would emerge like promises when the snow finally melted. I'd been outside since early morning, raking leaves and cutting back the perennials that had finished blooming for the season. It was satisfying physical work that reminded me why I loved living on this property, why the idea of trading my garden for the sterile courtyard of a senior living facility felt like a kind of death. My back was a little sore from bending and lifting, but it was the good kind of soreness that comes from productive labor, not the ache of injury or infirmity. I was just finishing up around the rose bushes when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Looking up, I saw Rebecca's silver SUV parked behind my Honda, and my heart immediately sank. She wasn't supposed to be here. The cease and desist letter had made it clear that any future visits needed to be arranged in advance and with legitimate purpose. But there she was, striding across my lawn in her expensive athletic wear, her face set in the determined expression I'd learned to dread. "Margaret," she called out, her voice carrying the artificial brightness she used when she was planning something unpleasant. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere for you." "Rebecca," I said evenly, not moving from where I stood beside the garden bed. "What are you doing here?" "I tried calling, but you didn't answer your phone," she said, pulling her cell phone from her pocket and waving it dramatically. "I was worried something might have happened to you." I pulled my own phone from my gardening apron and checked the call log. There were no missed calls from Rebecca, no voicemails, no text messages. She was lying, and we both knew it. "My phone has been with me all morning, Rebecca. You haven't called." Her expression flickered for just a moment, a flash of irritation. That she'd been caught in an obvious lie, before the concerned smile reasserted itself. "Well, maybe there's a problem with my phone," she said dismissively. "The important thing is that I'm here now. Margaret, we need to talk. If you want to talk, you can call my attorney and schedule an appointment. You're not supposed to be here without permission." "Oh, for heaven's sake, Margaret. I'm family. I shouldn't need permission to check on my husband's mother." The casual dismissal of the legal boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish sent a flash of anger through me. But I kept my voice calm. Harold had always taught me that the person who loses their temper first loses the argument. and I wasn't about to give Rebecca that advantage. You're here in violation of a cease and desist order, Rebecca. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Margaret, I'm not leaving until we've had a chance to discuss something very important. She took a step closer, and I noticed that she was holding a manila folder in her other hand. I've been doing some research, and I found some information that I think you need to see. What kind of information? Information about what happens to elderly people who refuse to accept help from their families. Her voice took on the patronizing tone that had become so familiar over the past 2 years. Margaret, I know you think you're being independent, but the statistics are really frightening. Do you know how many seniors are injured or killed every year because they insisted on living alone? Rebecca, I'm not discussing this with you. Please leave my property. I can't do that, Margaret. Not when I have evidence that you're putting yourself in serious danger. She opened the manila folder and pulled out a stack of printed articles, waving them at me like evidence in a courtroom. Look at this. A 73-year-old woman in Hartford fell down her stairs and wasn't found for 3 days. A 68-year-old man in New Haven had a stroke while gardening and died because no one was there to call for help. Margaret, these could be stories about you. The manipulation was so blatant, so obviously calculated to frighten me into compliance, that I almost laughed. She'd driven to my house, lied about calling me, ignored a legal order requiring her to stay away, and was now trying to terrorize me with random news stories about elderly people having accidents. Rebecca, millions of people over 65 live independently without incident. Cherry-picking tragic stories doesn't prove that I'm in danger. But what if you are? What if something happens to you while you're out here playing in the dirt and no one finds you until it's too late? Playing in the dirt. The dismissive phrase revealed exactly what she thought about my gardening, my independence, my right to live my life as I chose. To Rebecca, my activities weren't legitimate pursuits that brought me joy and purpose. They were the foolish pastimes of an old woman too stubborn to accept her limitations. What I do in my own yard is none of your business, Rebecca. It is my business when Thomas and I are the ones who'll have to deal with the consequences of your poor decisions. Her mask was slipping now, the artificial concern giving way to the irritation and entitlement that had always lurked beneath the surface. Do you have any idea how stressful it is for us, constantly worrying about whether you're okay, whether you've fallen or gotten confused and wandered off, or had some kind of medical emergency? No one is asking you to worry about me. I've told you repeatedly that I'm fine. But you're not fine, Margaret. You think you're fine, but you're not seeing the bigger picture. She pulled out another piece of paper, this one looking more official than the news articles. I've been in touch with Dr. Reeves about your last physical exam. Dr. Reeves was my primary care physician, a kind man in his 50s who'd been taking care of me since Harold's death. I'd had my annual physical just 6 weeks earlier, and he'd pronounced me in excellent health for my age, better than many people decades younger. Dr. Reeves told me about your blood pressure medication, Rebecca continued, clearly pleased to have what she thought was damaging information. He said you need to be monitored more closely because of the dosage adjustment. I stared at her, in disbelief. Rebecca, my blood pressure is completely normal with medication. Dr. Reeves said I'm managing it perfectly. But what if you forget to take your medication? What if you take too much by accident? What if you have a reaction and no one is there to help you? What if a meteor hits the house? Rebecca, you can't live your life in fear of every possible thing that might go wrong. I'm not talking about meteors, Margaret. I'm talking about real documented risks that affect people your age every single day. The conversation was following the same pattern as every other attempt Rebecca had made to convince me that independence was dangerous. She'd present worst-case scenarios as inevitable outcomes, use fear tactics disguised as concern, and then position herself and Thomas as my only protection against disaster. It was psychological warfare designed to wear down my resistance through constant anxiety and self-doubt. But this time felt different. There was an urgency in her voice, a desperation that hadn't been there before. The cease and desist letter had clearly rattled her, and she was escalating because her previous tactics weren't working. That made her more dangerous, but it also meant she was more likely to make mistakes. Rebecca, I've heard all of this before. You're not telling me anything new, and you're not changing my mind about anything. I want you to leave. I'm not leaving until you agree to at least look at the materials I've brought you. She stepped closer again, and I noticed that her hands were shaking slightly. Margaret, there's something else. Something I haven't told you yet. What? Thomas and I have been talking to a specialist, a geriatrician who works with families dealing with elderly parents who refuse to accept help. She said that sometimes the kindest thing family members can do is intervene, even when the elderly person doesn't want help. The word intervene sent a chill down my spine. Michael Chen had warned me that this might happen, that if Rebecca couldn't convince me to comply voluntarily, she might try to force the issue through legal means. What kind of intervention are you talking about, Rebecca? We're thinking about filing a petition for guardianship, she said, the words coming out in a rush as if she'd been practicing them. We don't want to, but Margaret, you're not making good decisions anymore. Someone needs to step in and protect you from yourself. There it was. The threat that had been lurking beneath 2 years of manipulation and fake concern. They wanted to have me declared legally incompetent so they could take control of my finances, my property, and my life. They wanted to strip away my fundamental rights as an adult and reduce me to the status of a child who needed their permission to make basic decisions about my own existence. Rebecca, you need to leave my property right now. Margaret, please just listen to me. We've already talked to a lawyer, and she said we have a strong case. The incidents with your memory, your refusal to accept help, your insistence on doing dangerous activities like gardening, get out. My voice was low and deadly calm, the tone Harold used to use with students who had pushed him past his limit of patience. Get off my property right now, or I'm calling the police. You're just proving my point, Margaret. This kind of hostile, paranoid behavior isn't normal. It's exactly what the geriatrician said we should expect from someone whose cognitive abilities are declining. The gaslighting was breathtaking in its audacity. Rebecca had come to my home uninvited, threatened me with legal action, and was now claiming that my reasonable response to her threats was evidence of mental decline. She was trying to use my anger at her inappropriate behavior as justification for the very behavior that had made me angry. I'm calling the police, I said, pulling out my phone. Go ahead, Rebecca said, her voice taking on a note of triumph. Call them. Let them see how agitated and confused you get when someone tries to have a rational conversation with you about your safety. I realized with growing horror that this was exactly what she wanted. She was goading me into an emotional response that she could then point to as evidence of instability. If the police arrived to find me upset and angry while she remained calm and concerned, it would support her narrative that I was the problem. But I'd learned something about myself over the past few months. I was stronger and smarter than Rebecca gave me credit for. Instead of letting her manipulate me into losing control, I took a deep breath and made a different choice. You know what, Rebecca? You're absolutely right. I should call the police. But not because I'm agitated or confused. I should call them because you're trespassing on my property in violation of a legal order, and you're threatening me with frivolous litigation. I calmly dialed 911 and waited for the operator to answer. Wevan, what's your emergency? This is Margaret Patterson at 247 Elm Street in Millbrook Heights. I have someone on my property who is refusing to leave despite being served with a cease and desist order. She's become threatening, and I need an officer to escort her off my property. Ma'am, are you in immediate physical danger? No, but the person is making threats about legal action and refusing to leave when asked. I have documentation of the Cease and desist order if the officer needs to see it. We'll have someone there within 10 minutes, ma'am. Are you able to go inside and lock your doors until the officer arrives? Yes, I can do that. I hung up and looked at Rebecca, whose face had gone pale. Clearly, she hadn't expected me to actually call the police, and she definitely hadn't expected me to remain calm and rational while doing it. Margaret, you're making a terrible mistake, she said, backing toward her car. When Thomas finds out about this. When Thomas finds out about this, he'll learn that his wife has been harassing his mother in violation of a legal order. He'll also learn that you've been threatening me with guardianship proceedings based on fabricated evidence of incompetence. It's not fabricated. Margaret, you're 70 years old and living alone in a house that's too big for you. You're taking medication that requires monitoring, you're doing physical activities that could result in injury, and you're showing signs of paranoid thinking. Any court would agree that you need supervision. Then I guess we'll find out, won't we? Rebecca stood there for another moment, clearly struggling to decide whether to leave or continue the confrontation. The sound of sirens in the distance made the decision for her. This isn't over, Margaret, she said, hurrying toward her SUV. Thomas and I are going to do whatever it takes to protect you, whether you want our help or not. She was backing out of my driveway when the police cruiser turned onto my street. Officer Martinez, a young woman who'd responded to a break-in in my neighborhood 6 months earlier, approached my front door with a professional but friendly demeanor. Mrs. Patterson? You called about a trespassing incident? Yes, Officer Martinez. Thank you for coming so quickly. I explained the situation while showing her the cease and desist letter and my documentation of Rebecca's previous violations. Officer Martinez took notes and asked thoughtful questions, treating me with the respect and courtesy that Rebecca had been systematically denying me for 2 years. Mrs. Patterson, based on what you've told me, it sounds like you might want to consider filing for a restraining order. The cease and desist letter is a good first step, but a restraining order would give you more legal protection if this behavior continues. What would that involve? You'd need to go to court and present evidence of harassment. Given the documentation you've already gathered, I think you'd have a strong case. And, Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that you handled this situation exactly right. You stayed calm, documented everything, and called for help when you needed it. That's not the behavior of someone who's confused or incompetent. After Officer Martinez left, I stood in my garden looking at the scattered papers Rebecca had dropped in her haste to escape, the news articles about elderly accidents, the notes from her conversation with the geriatrician, the draft petition for guardianship that she'd clearly brought to intimidate me with. As I gathered up the papers, I realized that Rebecca had made a crucial mistake. In her eagerness to threaten me, she'd revealed her entire strategy. I now knew exactly what she was planning, how she intended to proceed, and what evidence she thought she had against me. More importantly, I had documentation of her threats and harassment, witnessed by a police officer who'd noted Rebecca's inappropriate behavior in an official report. That evening, I called Michael Chen and described the day's events. His response was immediate and decisive. Margaret, we're filing for a restraining order first thing Monday morning, and we're also going to send a letter to this geriatrician Rebecca mentioned, warning her that any involvement in a guardianship proceeding based on false information could result in professional sanctions. What about the guardianship threat? Let them try. Based on your medical evaluations, your demonstrated competency, and the evidence of their harassment, any attempt to have you declared incompetent would not only fail, it would likely result in sanctions against them for filing a frivolous petition. Michael, what if they find a doctor who's willing to say, I'm incompetent? Margaret, you've been evaluated by 3 different physicians in the past 6 months. You've passed comprehensive cognitive assessments with flying colors. You're managing your own finances, maintaining your property, and living independently, without any signs of impairment. No legitimate medical professional would declare you incompetent based on the evidence. That night, as I sat in my living room reviewing the papers Rebecca had left behind, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of being completely and utterly underestimated by people who thought they were smarter than me. Rebecca had come to my house expecting to find a frightened, confused old woman who could be bullied into submission. Instead, she'd encountered someone who was prepared, documented everything, and knew exactly how to respond to threats and intimidation. She'd revealed her entire plan while providing me with evidence of her harassment. She'd threatened me in front of a police officer who'd witnessed her inappropriate behavior. She'd shown me exactly what I was fighting against and given me all the ammunition I needed to fight back. Most importantly, she'd forced me to confront the reality that this wasn't going to end with cease and desist letters and reasonable boundaries. Thomas and Rebecca were prepared to use the legal system to steal my independence, and they weren't going to stop until they either succeeded or were decisively defeated. Well, if Rebecca wanted a fight, she was about to discover that 70-year-old Margaret Patterson was not the helpless victim she'd imagined. I'd spent 43 years married to a man who'd taught me that bullies only understand strength, and I'd just been handed the perfect opportunity to show Rebecca exactly how strong a determined woman with nothing left to lose could be. The gloves were off now, and Rebecca had no idea what she'd just unleashed. The weekend following Rebecca's confrontation passed in a strange bubble of calm determination. I spent Saturday morning organizing all my documentation, medical records, financial statements, the cease and desist letter, Officer Martinez's incident report, and the threatening papers Rebecca had dropped during her hasty retreat. As I spread everything across my dining room table, I felt like a general preparing for battle, and in many ways, that's exactly what I was. Harold had always said that preparation was the key to winning any conflict, whether it was dealing with a difficult parent at school or navigating a complex bureaucracy. Know your facts, understand your rights, and never let emotions cloud your judgment, he'd tell his students when they faced academic challenges or disciplinary issues. Now, facing the most serious threat to my independence I'd ever encountered, I found myself drawing on his wisdom like a manual for psychological warfare. Sunday morning, I did something I hadn't done since Harold's funeral. I went to church. Not because I'd suddenly found religion, but because I needed to be seen and heard by my community. Rebecca's strategy depended on portraying me as an isolated, confused elderly woman whose family was heroically trying to save her from herself. The best way to counter that narrative was to demonstrate publicly that I was an engaged, competent member of society with a support network beyond my manipulative son and daughter-in-law. St. Mark's Episcopal Church was the same beautiful stone building where Harold and I had been married 43 years earlier, where we'd brought Thomas for baptism and confirmation, where we'd celebrated countless Christmas and Easter services together. I hadn't been back since Harold's memorial service, partly because the memories were too painful, but mostly because I'd been so focused on rebuilding my solitary life that I'd forgotten the value of community connections. Reverend Sarah Williams, who'd officiated at Harold's service, greeted me warmly at the door. "Margaret, how wonderful to see you. How are you doing?" "I'm doing well, Sarah. Better than I expected, actually." "I'm so glad to hear that. You know, Harold was so proud of how strong and independent you are. He used to say that he never worried about you because he knew you could handle anything life threw at you." The comment hit me like a lightning bolt. Harold had believed in my strength even when I doubted it myself. He'd seen qualities in me that I'd forgotten I possessed during the dark months after his death. Standing in the church where we'd shared so many milestones, I felt his presence more strongly than I had since the day he died. During the service, I found myself really listening to the readings and hymns for the first time in years. The sermon was about David facing Goliath, about how sometimes the most unlikely people find the courage to stand up against overwhelming odds. It felt like a sign, a reminder that being underestimated could be a strategic advantage rather than a weakness. After the service, I lingered for coffee hour in the parish hall, something I'd never done even when Harold was alive. We'd always been the type to slip out during the final hymn, eager to get home to our Sunday routines. But today, I needed to reconnect with people who'd known me as part of a couple, who'd seen me as Harold's capable partner rather than Thomas's burdensome mother. The conversations were revealing in ways I hadn't expected. Betty Morrison, who'd taught Sunday school with me when Thomas was young, mentioned that she'd heard from her neighbor about some family troubles I was having. "Margaret, dear, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right?" Susan, Henderson mentioned that there'd been some kind of police incident at your house. I realized that Rebecca's confrontation hadn't happened in a vacuum. Word had spread through the neighborhood that something was wrong, and people were forming opinions based on incomplete information. This was exactly the kind of community perception that could be used against me in a guardianship proceeding. "Betty, I appreciate your concern. I'm having some disagreements with my daughter-in-law about my living situation. She thinks I should move to a senior community, and I prefer to stay in my own home. Unfortunately, she's become rather aggressive about pushing her agenda." "Oh my," Betty said, her expression shifting from concern to understanding. "You mean she's one of those daughters-in-law who thinks she knows what's best for everyone?" "Something like that." "Well, for what it's worth, Margaret, you seem perfectly capable to me. You always were the most organized person I knew, and losing. Harold wouldn't change that. Some people just can't mind their own business." The conversation continued in that vein, with several other parishioners expressing similar sentiments. It became clear that my neighbors and acquaintances saw me as a competent adult dealing with family pressure, not as a confused elderly woman in need of intervention. This was valuable intelligence that could serve me well if legal proceedings became necessary. Monday morning, I arrived at Michael Chen's office with 3 overstuffed folders of documentation. Michael, a sharp-eyed man in his early 50s who'd earned Harold's trust through his careful handling of our estate planning, reviewed everything with the methodical attention to detail that had made him one of the most respected elder law attorneys in the county. "Margaret, this is an excellent foundation for both the restraining order and defending against any potential guardianship petition," he said after spending an hour reviewing my materials. "Rebecca made several critical errors that actually strengthen your position." "What kind of errors?" "First, she violated the cease and desist order in front of a police officer, which demonstrates a pattern of harassment and disregard for legal boundaries. Second, she threatened you with guardianship proceedings while you were clearly competent and responding appropriately to her inappropriate behavior. Third, she left behind documentation of her strategy, which shows premeditation and coordination." Michael pulled out Rebecca's dropped papers and spread them across his desk. "Look at this draft petition. It's full of vague allegations about memory issues and poor judgment without any specific examples or supporting medical evidence. The geriatrician she mentioned, Dr. Patricia Hendricks, hasn't even examined you. This is what we call a fishing expedition, and judges don't appreciate them. What about her claims about my medical condition? She seemed to think my blood pressure, medication was somehow evidence of incompetence. Margaret, you're taking a common blood pressure medication that millions of Americans take every day. Your most recent medical evaluation shows excellent management of a routine condition. Dr. Reeves has already provided a letter stating that you're in good health and show no signs of cognitive impairment. Rebecca's attempt to weaponize normal medical care actually demonstrates her desperation rather than your incompetence." Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from analytical to strategic. "Here's what I think is really happening. Thomas and Rebecca are under financial pressure, probably more than they've admitted to you. They see your house as their solution, but they can't access it while you're competent and refusing to sell. So they're trying to create a legal pathway to force the sale. Financial pressure? Thomas has a good job." I did some background research after our last conversation. Thomas filed for bankruptcy 4 years ago, shortly before he married Rebecca. They currently owe more on their townhouse than it's worth, And Rebecca's credit report shows significant debt from her pharmaceutical sales business. Your house represents approximately $800,000 in equity that they desperately need. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My son hadn't just been manipulated by his wife. He'd been an active participant in a calculated plan to steal my home. The financial desperation explained the urgency of their recent escalation, the willingness to risk legal consequences for harassment, the decision to threaten guardianship proceedings despite weak evidence. Michael, what are my options? We're going to fight this on multiple fronts. First, we're filing for a restraining order this afternoon that will legally prohibit both Thomas and Rebecca from coming to your property or contacting you, except through attorneys. Second, we're sending a formal notice to Dr. Hendricks warning her that participating in a guardianship evaluation without proper medical foundation could constitute professional misconduct. What about the guardianship threat itself? If they actually file a petition, we'll respond aggressively. I'll request an immediate competency hearing where you'll be evaluated by a court-appointed psychiatrist. Based on your recent medical records and documented competency, I'm confident you'll pass with flying colors. Then we'll countersue for malicious prosecution and seek sanctions against their attorney for filing a frivolous petition. Michael's confidence was reassuring, but I could see the concern in his eyes. Margaret, I need to be honest with you about something. Even though we have a strong case, guardianship proceedings can be emotionally devastating and financially draining. They're designed to be thorough, which means every aspect of your life will be scrutinized. Are you prepared for that level of invasion? Michael, I've been preparing for this my entire adult life, even though I didn't know it. Harold and I always believed that you fight for what's right, regardless of the cost. This isn't just about my house or my independence. It's about standing up to people who think they can bully elderly people into submission. Then we're going to give them the fight of their lives. That afternoon, we appeared before Judge Patricia Reynolds in family court to request the restraining order. Judge Reynolds, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been handling elder law cases for over 20 years, reviewed our petition with the kind of careful attention that gave me confidence in the judicial system. Mr. Chen, your client is alleging ongoing harassment by family members who are threatening guardianship proceedings. What evidence do you have to support these allegations? Michael presented our documentation systematically. The cease and desist letter, Officer Martinez's incident report, Rebecca's threatening papers, and my detailed log of harassment incidents. Judge Reynolds asked me several direct questions about my living situation, my medical care, and my decision-making capacity, all of which I answered clearly and comprehensively. Mrs. Patterson, do you understand what your son and daughter-in-law are alleging about your competency? Yes, Your Honor. They claim that I'm no longer capable of living independently because I'm 70 years old, take blood pressure medication, and engage in normal activities like gardening. They believe these factors justify forcing me to sell my home and move to a nursing facility against my will. And how do you respond to their concerns? Your Honor, I believe their concerns are pretextual. They're facing financial difficulties and see my house as a solution to their problems. Rather than asking for help directly, they've chosen to undermine my competency and threaten legal action to force me to comply with their demands. Judge Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Chen, I'm granting a temporary restraining order pending a full hearing in 2 weeks. The respondents are prohibited from contacting Mrs. Patterson directly, coming to her property, or involving third parties in surveillance or welfare checks without legitimate cause. Mrs. Patterson, do you have any questions about the terms of this order? No, Your Honor. Thank you. As we left the courthouse, I felt a surge of vindication that I hadn't experienced since Harold's death. The legal system had listened to my concerns, evaluated my competency, and determined that I deserved protection from harassment. I wasn't. Just a confused old woman whose family was trying to help her. I was a competent adult whose rights were being violated by people with ulterior motives. That evening, Michael's office served the restraining order on both Thomas and Rebecca. According to his investigator, Rebecca had received the papers with visible shock and anger, while Thomas had appeared genuinely confused about the legal implications of their behavior. It was possible that Thomas still didn't fully understand how manipulative and potentially criminal Rebecca's actions had been. The restraining order had an immediate and dramatic effect on their behavior. My phone stopped ringing constantly with wellness checks. My neighbors stopped getting calls asking them to spy on my activities. The feeling of being constantly watched and evaluated began to fade, replaced by a sense of security I hadn't felt in months. But the most significant change was in my own self-perception. For 2 years, I'd been gradually accepting Rebecca's narrative that I was a burden, a problem to be managed, an elderly woman whose preferences and autonomy were less important than other people's convenience. The restraining order forced me to articulate clearly why that narrative was wrong, why my independence was valuable, and why my right to make my own decisions deserved legal protection. The process of defending myself had reminded me who I really was, not Thomas's helpless mother or Rebecca's inconvenient obstacle, but Margaret Patterson, a competent adult with 43 years of successful marriage, 40 years of home ownership, and 7 decades of problem-solving experience behind her. 3 days after the restraining order was served, I received a call from Thomas. His voice was strained, confused, and more emotional than I'd heard him sound since Harold's funeral. "Mom, we need to talk. Rebecca says you've filed some kind of legal action against us. I don't understand what's happening. Thomas, you and Rebecca are prohibited from contacting me except through attorneys. You're violating the restraining order by calling me." "Mom, please. I'm not trying to violate anything. I just want to understand why you think we're your enemies. We're trying to help you." The pain in his voice was genuine, and for a moment I felt the old maternal instinct to comfort and reassure him. But I'd learned too much about manipulation tactics to trust my emotional responses without careful consideration. "Thomas, if you want to communicate with me, you need to do it through Michael Chen's office. That's what the court ordered, and that's what I'm going to follow." "But Mom, we're family. Families should be able to work things out without lawyers and courts." "Thomas, families should also be able to respect each other's autonomy without threats and harassment. When you and Rebecca chose to escalate this to legal threats, you changed the nature of our relationship. Mom, please don't do this. The girls are asking why they can't see Grandma anymore. How am I supposed to explain that their grandmother has taken out a restraining order against their parents?" There it was. The guilt weapon I'd been expecting. Using my granddaughters as emotional leverage to make me feel responsible for the consequences of Rebecca's behavior. It was the same tactic Rebecca had been using for 2 years, just delivered by Thomas instead. "Thomas, you can explain to the girls that sometimes adults have disagreements that require legal resolution. You can also explain that Grandma is protecting herself from people who are threatening to take away her home and her independence. We weren't threatening you, Mom. We were trying to help you plan for the future. Thomas, your wife came to my house and explicitly threatened guardianship proceedings if I didn't comply with her demands. That's not planning. That's coercion." The phone was quiet for a long moment. When Thomas spoke again, his voice was smaller, more uncertain. "Mom, Rebecca says you're not thinking clearly about this situation. She says that sometimes elderly people become paranoid and see threats where none exist." And there it was. The final confirmation that Thomas had been completely co-opted by Rebecca's manipulation. He wasn't just going along with her plan to steal my house. He genuinely believed that my resistance to their demands was evidence of mental decline rather than rational self-protection. "Thomas, I'm hanging up now. If you want to continue this conversation, contact my attorney." "Mom, wait." I disconnected the call and immediately phoned Michael Chen's office to report the restraining order violation. Within an hour, Thomas received a formal warning that any further contact would result in contempt of court charges. The message was clear. The legal system was taking my protections seriously, and there would be consequences for anyone who continued to harass me. That night, I sat in my living room looking through photo albums from happier times, pictures of Thomas as a child, family vacations, holiday celebrations, graduations and birthdays, and all the milestones that had once bound us together as a loving family. The sadness I felt wasn't just for the loss of those relationships, but for the realization that they might never have been as genuine as I'd believed. How long had Thomas seen me as a burden rather than a person? How long had Rebecca been planning? To steal my home? How many of their expressions of love and concern had been strategic manipulations designed to soften my resistance to their eventual demands? But alongside the sadness, I felt something else. A deep, satisfying sense of my own power. For the first time in 2 years, I was setting the terms of engagement. I was protected by law, supported by professionals, and armed with evidence of their misconduct. I was no longer reacting to their attacks. I was controlling the battlefield. Rebecca had made a fundamental miscalculation. She'd assumed that age made me weak, that grief made me vulnerable, that isolation made me desperate for any kind of family connection. She'd thought she could bully me into submission through psychological warfare and legal threats. What she'd actually done was awaken a fierce protectiveness of my own independence that I hadn't known I possessed. She'd forced me to become strategic, methodical, and utterly ruthless in defending what was mine. The woman who'd been intimidated by Rebecca's surprise visits and manipulation tactics no longer existed. In her place stood someone who understood exactly what she was fighting for and exactly how to win. The restraining order was just the beginning. If Thomas and Rebecca wanted to continue this fight, they were about to discover that 70-year-old Margaret Patterson was a far more formidable opponent than they'd ever imagined. 2 weeks after the restraining order was granted, the day I'd been both dreading and anticipating finally arrived. Despite Michael Chen's warnings and the legal protections in place, Thomas and Rebecca had decided to proceed with filing a guardianship petition. Their attorney, a young man named David Walsh, who specialized in what he euphemistically called family transition planning, had apparently convinced them that they could overcome the evidence of harassment by focusing on my supposed cognitive decline and unsafe living conditions. They'd made their biggest mistake yet. Michael called me at 7 a.m. on the morning the petition was filed, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Margaret, they've actually done it. They filed for emergency guardianship, claiming you're in immediate danger and need protective intervention." "What kind of immediate danger?" "According to their petition, you're exhibiting signs of paranoid delusions, making irrational decisions about your living situation, and demonstrating hostility toward family members trying to provide necessary care. They claim that your refusal to move to assisted living and your aggressive legal actions are evidence of diminished capacity." I felt a moment of pure rage at the audacity of their claims, followed immediately by something close to satisfaction. They'd just handed me the perfect opportunity to destroy their credibility completely and publicly. "Michael, when is the hearing?" "Judge, Reynolds scheduled an emergency competency evaluation for this afternoon. She wants to resolve this quickly, especially given the existing restraining order and the harassment documentation we already have on file." "What should I expect?" "The court will appoint a psychiatrist to evaluate your mental capacity. You'll be interviewed, given cognitive tests, and asked about your living situation and decision-making process. Based on your previous medical evaluations, I'm confident you'll pass with flying colors. But Margaret, I need to warn you about something." "What?" "Thomas and Rebecca have apparently been building their case for months. They have statements from neighbors about your erratic behavior, documentation of your isolation, and claims about incidents that supposedly demonstrate confusion or poor judgment. Most of it appears to be either fabricated or taken completely out of context, but we need to be prepared to address their allegations systematically." "What kind of allegations?" They claim you've been seen talking to yourself in the garden, that you've forgotten appointments and become confused about dates, that you've made concerning statements about people trying to hurt you. They're painting a picture of an elderly woman who's lost touch with reality and needs protective intervention. The systematic nature of their deception was breathtaking. For months, they'd been gathering ammunition for this moment, documenting normal behaviors and reframing them as evidence of incompetence. My conversations with the cardinals in my garden became talking to myself. My decision to skip social events I didn't enjoy became isolation. My accurate assessment of their manipulation became paranoid delusions. Michael, how do we counter that? With facts, documentation, and expert testimony. Dr. Reeves has agreed to testify about your excellent health and cognitive function. Officer Martinez will testify about your appropriate response to harassment. And Margaret, you're going to testify about your life, your competency, and your right to make your own decisions. That afternoon, I arrived at the courthouse dressed in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to Harold's funeral and hadn't touched since. I wanted to look like what I was, a competent, dignified woman who deserved respect and legal protection. Michael met me at the entrance, carrying 2 briefcases full of evidence that would, hopefully, end this nightmare once and for all. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a harsh, institutional glow. Thomas and Rebecca sat at the plaintiff's table with their attorney, and seeing them there, formally aligned against me in a legal proceeding designed to strip away my fundamental rights, was like a punch to the stomach. Thomas wouldn't meet my eyes, his face pale and drawn with what might have been guilt or fear. Rebecca, however, stared directly at me with an expression of cold determination. She was dressed in a conservative black suit, with her hair pulled back severely, projecting an image of concerned respectability that I now recognized as completely fabricated. Judge Reynolds entered the courtroom with the same no-nonsense demeanor she'd displayed during the restraining order hearing. We're here today to consider a petition for emergency guardianship filed by Thomas Patterson and Rebecca Patterson against Margaret Patterson. Given the existing restraining order and the serious nature of these allegations, I want to proceed carefully and thoroughly. David Walsh, Thomas and Rebecca's attorney, presented their case with a combination of legal jargon and emotional manipulation that was clearly designed to portray me as a dangerous, confused, elderly woman whose family was heroically trying to save her from herself. Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson is a 70-year-old widow who has been exhibiting increasingly concerning behaviors since her husband's death 2 years ago. She's become isolated, paranoid, and hostile toward family members who are trying to provide necessary support and guidance. He presented their evidence methodically. Photographs of my garden that supposedly showed neglect and dangerous conditions, statements from neighbors describing my erratic behavior, and medical records that he claimed demonstrated concerning cognitive changes requiring supervision. Mrs. Patterson has refused reasonable suggestions about safer living arrangements, has taken legal action against family members who were trying to help her, and has made statements indicating paranoid delusions about people trying to steal her home. This pattern of behavior demonstrates a clear decline in judgment and decision-making capacity that requires immediate protective intervention. As I listened to Walsh's presentation, I realized he was essentially reading from Rebecca's script. Every allegation, every interpretation, every supposed example of incompetence reflected her systematic campaign to undermine my credibility. Thomas might have been the named petitioner, but this was Rebecca's show from beginning to end. When Walsh finished, Judge Reynolds turned to Michael with an expression that suggested she'd heard similar cases before and wasn't easily impressed by dramatic allegations without supporting evidence. Mr. Chen, how does your client respond to these allegations? Michael stood and delivered what I can only describe as a masterclass in legal advocacy. He systematically dismantled every claim Walsh had made, using documentation, expert testimony, and simple logic to reveal the manipulation and fabrication underlying the entire petition. Your Honor, what we have here is not a concerned family trying to help an incompetent elderly woman. What we have is a calculated campaign of harassment and intimidation, designed to force Mrs. Patterson to surrender her home and independence to people who are facing serious financial difficulties. He presented the evidence of Thomas and Rebecca's bankruptcy, their debt problems, and the financial motivation underlying their sudden concern about my living situation. He showed the court officer Martinez's incident report documenting Rebecca's harassment and threats. He introduced medical testimony from Dr. Reeves confirming my excellent cognitive function and physical health. Mrs. Patterson is not isolated, paranoid, or incompetent. She's a woman who recognized manipulation when she saw it, sought appropriate legal protection when she was threatened, and has consistently demonstrated excellent judgment throughout this ordeal. Then it was my turn to testify. Judge Reynolds had me sworn in and asked me to state my name and address for the record. When I answered clearly and confidently, I saw Rebecca's jaw tighten with what might have been frustration or fear. Mrs. Patterson, how do you respond to the allegations that you're no longer capable of living independently? Your Honor, I believe those allegations are false and motivated by financial desperation rather than genuine concern for my welfare. I live independently, manage my own finances, maintain my property, and make my own medical decisions. I've been evaluated by multiple physicians who've confirmed my competency. The only people questioning my capacity are people who want to profit from taking control of my assets. What about the claims that you've been exhibiting paranoid behavior toward family members? Your Honor, I don't consider it paranoid to recognize manipulation and protect myself from people who are threatening to steal my home. When someone explicitly threatens guardianship proceedings if you don't comply with their demands, the appropriate response is to seek legal protection, not to submit to coercion. Judge Reynolds asked me detailed questions about my daily life, my decision-making process, my medical care, and my understanding of the legal proceedings. Every answer I gave demonstrated clear thinking, excellent memory, and appropriate judgment. By the time she finished questioning me, it was obvious to everyone in the courtroom that I was exactly what I claimed to be: a competent adult who'd been targeted for financial exploitation. The court-appointed psychiatrist, Dr. Jennifer Kim, had evaluated me earlier that morning and was called to present her findings. Her testimony was devastating to Thomas and Rebecca's case. Your Honor, I've conducted a comprehensive cognitive evaluation of Mrs. Patterson, including standardized tests for memory, reasoning, and decision-making capacity. Her performance was not only within normal limits, it was exceptional for someone of any age. She demonstrates excellent judgment, clear understanding of complex situations, and appropriate responses to threatening behavior. Doctor, what's your professional opinion about Mrs. Patterson's capacity to make her own decisions about her living situation? Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson is fully competent to make all decisions about her life, her finances, and her living arrangements. There is no medical basis for any form of guardianship or protective intervention. In fact, her decision to seek legal protection from harassment demonstrates excellent judgment and self-advocacy skills. When Dr. Kim finished testifying, Judge Reynolds turned to Walsh with an expression that could only be described as judicial displeasure. Mr. Walsh, based on the testimony and evidence presented today, I'm having difficulty understanding the basis for your emergency guardianship petition. Can you point to any credible evidence that Mrs. Patterson lacks the capacity to make her own decisions? Walsh clearly hadn't expected the hearing to go so badly for his clients. He stammered through a response that essentially repeated his earlier allegations without any supporting evidence, focusing on my hostility toward family members and my refusal to accept help. Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson's aggressive legal actions against family members who were trying to help her suggests a concerning pattern of paranoid thinking. Judge Reynolds cut him off mid-sentence. Mr. Walsh, seeking legal protection from Harassment is not paranoid thinking, it's appropriate self-advocacy. Filing a restraining order against people who are threatening you is not aggressive behavior. It's exactly what we advise citizens to do when they're being intimidated. She turned her attention to Thomas and Rebecca, her voice taking on the stern tone I imagined she used for the most serious cases. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, I want to be very clear about what's happened here today. You've filed an emergency guardianship petition against a competent adult based on fabricated or grossly misrepresented evidence. You've attempted to use the legal system to force your mother into a living situation that benefits you financially rather than serving her best interests. Thomas had gone completely pale and was staring at his hands. Rebecca's face was flushed with anger, but she had enough sense to remain silent. Mrs. Patterson, Judge Reynolds continued, addressing me directly, I'm dismissing this petition with prejudice, which means it cannot be refiled. You are and remain a fully competent adult with the right to make your own decisions about your life and your property. But Judge Reynolds wasn't finished. Mr. Walsh, I'm referring this case to the State Bar for investigation of potential ethical violations. Filing frivolous petitions based on fabricated evidence is a serious matter that could result in professional sanctions. She turned back to Thomas and Rebecca. I'm also extending the existing restraining order indefinitely and adding additional provisions. You are prohibited from filing any future legal actions against Mrs. Patterson without demonstrating legitimate cause and obtaining court approval first. Any violations will result in contempt charges and potential criminal prosecution. As we left the courthouse, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. I'd won completely. My competency had been established beyond any doubt. The harassment would finally stop, and Thomas and Rebecca had been exposed as the manipulative, potentially criminal actors they'd always been. But the victory had come, at the cost of any remaining relationship with my son and his family. Michael walked me to my car, his expression reflecting both professional satisfaction and personal concern. Margaret, you handled that perfectly. Judge Reynolds couldn't have been clearer about your competency and their misconduct. What happens now? Now you go home and live your life exactly as you choose. The restraining order protects you legally. The court record establishes your competency permanently, and Thomas and Rebecca have been warned that any future harassment will result in serious legal consequences. What about my grandsons? Will I ever see Jake and Mason again? That's up to Thomas. If he's smart, he'll realize that his wife nearly destroyed his relationship with his mother and cost him any chance of inheriting your estate. If he wants to rebuild that relationship, he'll have to do it on your terms, not Rebecca's. That evening, I sat in my garden watching the sunset over the property that Rebecca had tried so hard to steal from me. The restraining order papers were filed away with the rest of my legal documents. The house deed was safely locked in my safe deposit box, along with an updated will that left everything to charity rather than to family members who'd proven they couldn't be trusted. For the first time in 2 years, I felt truly secure in my own home. The changes that followed were remarkable. Without the constant stress of manipulation and surveillance, my health improved dramatically. My blood pressure dropped to levels Dr. Reeves hadn't seen since before Harold's death. I slept better, ate better, and found myself enjoying activities I'd forgotten I loved. I rejoined my book club with enthusiasm, started volunteering at the animal shelter again, and even began taking weekend trips to visit my sister in Florida. The social isolation that Rebecca had claimed was evidence of my deterioration had actually been a result of her harassment campaign. Once that ended, I rediscovered the active, engaged social life I'd been living before she'd made me afraid to leave my own house. 6 months after the hearing, I received an unexpected phone call from Thomas. His voice was different, older, sadder, and stripped of the confident entitlement that had characterized our conversations during Rebecca's campaign. Mom, I know I'm not supposed to call you directly, but I needed to tell you something. Thomas, you're violating the restraining order. I know. But Mom, Rebecca and I are getting divorced. I've filed the papers, and I'm moving out of the house next month. The news should have brought me satisfaction, but instead I felt only sadness for the destruction Rebecca had caused to our entire family. I'm sorry to hear that, Thomas. Mom, I need you to know that I didn't understand what Rebecca was doing until the court hearing. I thought she really was trying to help you, trying to protect you from making mistakes that could hurt you. I didn't realize she was manipulating both of us. Thomas, Rebecca didn't force you to participate in threatening your mother with guardianship proceedings. You made that choice yourself. You're right. I did. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. His voice cracked slightly. Mom, I know I don't deserve it, but is there any chance you could ever forgive me? Could we ever rebuild our relationship? I thought about Harold's advice about forgiveness, that it was something you did for yourself, not for the person who'd wronged you. Carrying anger and resentment would only poison my own peace of mind. Thomas, forgiveness is possible, but rebuilding trust will take time, and it will have to happen on my terms. You'll need to demonstrate through consistent actions, over years, not words, that you respect my autonomy and won't try to control my decisions again. I understand. Mom, would it be possible for me to visit you sometime? With Jake and Mason? They ask about Grandma Margaret all the time, and I think they should know their grandmother. Contact Michael Chen's office to arrange a supervised visit. If that goes well, we can consider regular visitation. 3 months later, Thomas brought Jake and Mason for their first visit since the court hearing. The boys, now 13 years old and growing rapidly, were polite but cautious, clearly aware that something serious had happened between the adults in their lives, even if they didn't understand the details. As we sat in my living room eating cookies and talking about their school and sports activities, I realized that this was what family should feel like: relaxed, genuine, based on choice rather than obligation. Thomas watched his sons interact with me with an expression of profound regret, and I suspected he was finally understanding what Rebecca's greed had cost all of us. Today, 2 years after Judge Reynolds dismissed the guardianship petition, I'm living exactly the life I choose. I'm 72 years old, completely independent, and more confident in my own judgment than I've ever been. My house is my sanctuary, my garden is my therapy, and my independence is my greatest treasure. Thomas and I have rebuilt a cautious but genuine relationship based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. He visits twice a month with the boys, and we're slowly learning to trust each other again. He's in therapy, working to understand how he was manipulated and developing the skills to recognize and resist emotional exploitation in the future. Rebecca, I'm told, has moved to another state and is no longer in contact with any of us. Thomas's divorce attorney mentioned that she'd been involved in similar elder care schemes before meeting Thomas, which confirmed my suspicion that I'd been specifically targeted rather than randomly victimized. But the most important change isn't in my circumstances, it's in my understanding of my own power. For 70 years, I'd defined myself primarily in relation to other people, as Harold's wife, Thomas's mother, a helpful neighbor, a supportive friend. I'd thought that love meant accommodating other people's demands, that family loyalty required, accepting whatever treatment relatives chose to give me. Rebecca's attack on my independence forced me to discover who Margaret Patterson was when stripped of all those relational roles. It turned out that underneath all the accommodation and people-pleasing was a woman of considerable strength, intelligence, and determination who was perfectly capable of fighting for herself and winning. The house that Rebecca tried so hard to steal from me is still mine. But more importantly, the life she tried to control is still mine as well. I wake up every morning in my own bed, in my own home, making my own decisions about how to spend my time and energy. At 72, I'm not winding down toward some inevitable decline into dependency and institutional care. I'm living fully, purposefully, and completely on my own terms. I have friendships based on mutual respect, family relationships based on choice rather than obligation, and the unshakable knowledge that I'm capable of protecting myself from anyone who tries to take advantage of me. Rebecca thought she was teaching me that I was a burden who needed to be managed by stronger, smarter people. Instead, she taught me that I was a force to be reckoned with, someone who could outwit, outmaneuver, and outlast anyone foolish enough to underestimate the power of a determined 70-year-old woman with nothing left to lose. The deed to my house is in my name. The title to my car is in my name. The decisions about my life are mine to make. And anyone who thinks age makes me weak or vulnerable is welcome to find out just how wrong they are. Some battles are worth fighting, even when, especially when, you're fighting them alone. The victory isn't just about keeping what's yours. It's about proving to yourself and the world that you're someone worth fighting for. "You're just a guest here," Rebecca had said, thinking she was putting me in my place. She was right about one thing: guests don't have to stay when they're not welcome. But she was wrong about who the guest was, as I told the realtor when I put her house on the market after Thomas moved out. Some people never learn that you don't bite the hand that could have fed you. My house, my rules, my life. And that's exactly how it's going to stay. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.